Hi, I'm Emily, and I would like to share with you some things that I tell the teachers about my type 1 diabetic children before they enter school. Usually, as it gets close to the beginning of the school year, I call the school when I know that the teachers are there, and I have it in my Children's 504 plan, which we'll talk about later, that a teacher meeting is needed. I have found this to be really valuable so that the teachers and I are on the same page and we have the same goal in mind of the child's education being foremost, but also their health is going to have a major impact on how their learning is going to happen. So the first thing I do when I meet with the teachers is I bring some things that introduce our family and kind of put a personal face on this type 1 diabetes. So I usually bring our family photo and I will say, this is our family, and actually I have 3 of my children that are type 1 diabetic. So I could say I'm talking about this son or this son or this daughter, and I'd like to tell you about this student that will be in your class this year. Now, I bring for the teachers also at this meeting a packet of papers, and I don't like to read directly through the entire packet, but I do think it's important that they have this information. So I try to hit the highlights. On the top of the packet is a Dear Teacher letter that I also have adapted on my computer. It can be Dear Coach, and I give it to the swim team coach or the basketball coach or the soccer coach. It can be Dear Fellow Parent. Maybe my child is going on a church youth group field trip or something like that. And this letter is just simply something that I adapted out of the Pink Panther book, Understanding Diabetes. And this is an excellent resource that has all different letters that you can adapt to your circumstance. The most important thing about this letter that I've written, I think, is the first part, and it just introduces my child and says, we do not want this student singled out because of their diabetes, and hopefully everything will be normal, but here are some things that you should know in case of an emergency and also to promote learning. Now, the next thing in the packet is a sheet of paper called What is Diabetes? And I just copied this out of the American Diabetes Association. Gave us this, which is a booklet. There's 2 different spiral bound booklets in here, one for the children and one for the parents, that just have basic chapters on what is diabetes and kind of an introduction to it. I especially like this, and that one is called Wisdom, W-I-Z-D-O-M. I especially like this page because this has a very concise little paragraph that says type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes, and it compares them. I usually bring a banana and an apple because I'm a teacher and I like to have a very concrete kind of a visual aid for them to think about. And I say, this one is type 2 diabetes. This one is what most people in America have. When you think of diabetes and a person, oh, you know, maybe they're overweight or maybe they can't eat sugar, they want to stay away from taking insulin shots, that's type 2 diabetes. That's what most Americans have. This is an apple. This represents type 1 diabetes. This is my child. Now, they're both fruits. Both things do have to do with how your body handles insulin. But they're very different fruits. They're different colors. I try to bring a red apple usually, but I didn't have one in my fridge today. One you peel, one you don't have to peel, one you eat the seeds, one you can't eat the seeds. I just think it's a really good thing for them to remember, and then I usually set these on the table so that they're right there while we're talking about this. I explain briefly that type 2 diabetes involves your body is still making insulin but not making quite enough. And so the person tries to eat less sugar and help their body to manage itself with the insulin that is being made. I try to make the explanation extremely simple, and not get too complex or medical terminology, use a lot of that kind of thing, just because I think it's important for people to just get the main message. Then I explain about type 1 diabetes. This is my child who's going to be a student in your class this year. Type 1 diabetes is not especially inherited. It is not the fault of the student. It is not caused by anything they did. They did not do something that caused their body to be unhealthy so that this came upon them. This is just something that has happened. Scientists have discovered there are genes that can predispose you to type 1 diabetes. There are also genes that can protect you from it. And they have identified, I've read in magazines, of twins and triplets who are identical. One has type 1 diabetes, one doesn't. So they know that it's not exclusively genetic, and it's very important to know that this is not something that's contagious or, anything like that. This is just one of those cards that life hands you. And so we as a team, the teachers and I, we need to help this student to manage themselves so that their learning can happen in the best way possible. Usually as a part of what I tell the teachers, I tell them how my child was diagnosed. So I will tell you, my first child that was diagnosed, he was 9 years old, and he just got a terrible stomach flu. It was like 5 days of throwing up, and it was awful. And then after this, it was right close to Halloween, and I remember him being so excited for Halloween. He was 9 years old, and he wanted more than anything to dress up and go trick-or-treating. So I promised him, no matter what, we could take him around in the car, he would get to go trick-or-treating. And what ended up happening was he never really recovered from this flu that he had. He just was weak. He was going to the bathroom all the time. He was really thirsty, and he lost 15 pounds in 2 weeks, and we didn't know what was the matter. So we took him to the, and we did take him trick-or-treating around, but we got about halfway around the neighborhood where we usually go, and he wanted to be taken home. He was just too tired. But we took him to the pediatrician, and the pediatrician did just a quick test. I mean, like 5 minutes, 10-minute test, and just came in and said, your son is type 1 diabetic. And we didn't even really know what that meant, but he said he needs to be admitted to the hospital just simply so that you can learn how to manage this and give him shots and monitor his blood sugar. And I felt like saying, are you sure you couldn't do another more complicated test to test for this? Because how could it be just a 10-minute test and then his entire life has changed? But I usually try to emphasize to the teachers that we try to take a positive approach with our children about their type 1 diabetes. There are worse things to happen to a person, and we try to be proactive and just do the best we can. Another thing that I have in the pamphlet, the next packet paper that I have for the teachers, is about diabetes and discrimination. Now, these papers that I've put in, you can choose your own papers you think that would be well suited for your teachers. I just really feel it's important that teachers understand where they are legally as far as discrimination, where disabilities are concerned. And type 1 diabetes can be a disability if it is not managed well. For instance, years and years ago, when my oldest child was diabetic, I had to go on all of the field trips with him, or he had to stay home from the field trips that his elementary school was taking. But now there are laws that protect him and state that someone must attend those field trips. Who knows what to do in case of an emergency? So I'm very grateful for that, and each person needs to check their own state laws so that you can be aware and let your teachers know what is appropriate. In the state of Arizona, where I live, there is a law that they are allowed to go on field trips. They are allowed to be in sports. They can test their blood sugar in class. They do not have to be excused to go to the nurse's office. They can eat snacks in the class or on the bus. I've had My oldest child, who is type 1 diabetic, was in high school choir and regional choir and all of these musical things where they said no food is allowed. And I just sent him with a little letter stating about how he was diabetic and snacks in his bag, and there was never any problem. People were very understanding. I think as long as you're willing to communicate with them, I think teachers and everybody wants to help your child participate as much as possible. They also legally, it's not allowed that they can be punished for being absent from class due to their diabetes. And they also are to be allowed to participate in after-school activities. So these are just some things that I think it's very important that teachers are aware of. Then the next sheet of paper is important facts about juvenile diabetes, and this is published by the JDRF. And I just think it's important that they realize how predominant type 1 diabetes is, because it really is more common than most people realize, and it's becoming more and more common. So I think it's important to educate these teachers, and if you think about it, if you're telling your child's teachers about type 1 diabetes, then the next child that they have who is type 1 diabetic, they will already have a calm sense of what to do and how to approach it. And even though every child handles their diabetes differently, they still will have a little bit of a sense of what to expect. And then the last sheet of paper that I have in my packet is simply a quote that I found that I love that talks about normalization. And it just says that normalization is not about treating someone as if they were normal. Those with physical disabilities or chronic medical conditions know that there is something different about them, yet they feel pressured to participate in the delusion of being just like everyone else in order to please the adults around them. The underlying message is that different is bad and must be hidden. Normalization is about empowering and enabling the different person so they are able to feel that their presence and involvement, apart from their particular needs and abilities, is normal. So just by being there, they are normal and accepted just as a part of the group. When the disability or medical condition does not serve to define the individual and their worth, there is no need to try to be normal in order to be okay. The reality-based view leads to self-acceptance, a healthy appreciation of individual differences, and an assertive attitude towards accepting the help of others in meeting their special needs. So I just really like this quote. I think it's important. I always try to let the teachers know that we are on the same team. I give them many phone numbers. They can reach me anytime. I try to assure them that I want to have lots of communication. If there's any problem, I want to be involved. Some of my children who are type 1 diabetic, when their blood sugar is high, they get very emotional, very grouchy, kind of combative. And, if ever this is a problem, I want to know about it, and we can work together to solve it. It's kind of a trick with a child to know if it is their diabetes or if it is just a normal childhood, contrary mood. And I think as parents and teachers, everybody wants it to turn out so that their learning can happen in the best way. And if you start at the beginning of the year and you set this up with your child, and if possible do a 504 plan, which usually we also take care of at this big meeting of the teachers because everyone needs to sign it. The 504 is a student accommodation plan, and the 504 is really important for diabetics. Although a lot of schools kind of don't know how to do it or don't know what to do with it, it's very important legally for your child to have this, because in this 504 plan, you can state what you would like to have happen as a parent, and the teachers are required to sign it and then make it happen. And usually the 504 is used for students with, lots of disability, maybe learning disabilities, and it describes the accommodations that they need. Now this 504 is for my child, and this says, let's see. So it says the nature of the student's mental or physical impairment. We just state what the diagnosis is. They have insulin-dependent diabetes, type 1 diabetes. What is the major life activity? Substantially limited by this impairment. And so we have just put, this is a life-threatening disorder. It can affect breathing, learning, and consciousness. And then there's different questions, and you just ask about them. Now, I have a copy of this that can be made available to anyone. I really like, under specific accommodations to be made by school, we put that they need to have flexible blood sugar testing. They can test anywhere, anytime, and they have the right to have their glucometer with them anywhere, anytime. I always emphasize to the teachers, sometimes there's concern if they're not educated because there's a little sharp, we call it a pricker, that, you know, what's used to prick their finger, so they draw the blood and test. And I always emphasize to the teachers that my child does not want to be diabetic. My child is somewhat embarrassed by this, and they're just going to test their blood sugar like this and be very, very quick about it, and it's going to be very, very non-intrusive to the classroom. It's not going to be a problem. The only thing the teacher has to be aware of is if they see them testing their blood sugar, they might want to just kind of wander over and ask the child what their blood sugar number is. And on my letter, I've put what their range should be, so that if they're very low or if they're very high, the teacher can then refer them to the health office. Let's see. Another thing that I think is very important to put on the 504 plan is that whenever my child needs to go to the medical office or the health office, they need to always be accompanied by someone else. Because my child looks totally normal, they assume that there's no problem, and they don't realize that low blood sugar can happen, especially in children, very quickly, and they could pass out and be on the floor, and they need to have someone with them who would know what to do. So it may or may not be one of their friends, depending on if their friends are able to handle that kind of a situation. The best thing that I've found nowadays is most classrooms have telephones that can reach the nurse's office, and if they can call the nurse's office and have the nurse come to them if there's a situation that's real iffy. Usually most school health personnel are willing to do that. Another thing in the 504 is that my child is allowed to carry with them at all times. I call it a fanny pack, but my boys kind of did the man bag thing. My girl has a purse that has in it their snacks, their glucometer, everything. Now, at my children's school, they do not allow them to carry backpacks because they don't want to have issues with weapons or other food or whatever in the classrooms. But my child, because of the 504, is allowed to carry their small, emergency supplies for their diabetes, and I think that's an important right. Another thing that I have on the 504 that I think is great is that each teacher must have a copy of this 504 in their substitute folder, so that if they're absent, the substitute is aware of this, so that if something should happen, the substitute doesn't just think your child is zoning out. Maybe their blood sugar is going really low. I have one boy who was dropping low very fast, and he would come to us and he would say, oh, my number is, whatever it was very low. And we would say, oh, go get a snack, go to the kitchen right away. And he would just take off to his bedroom. And he just didn't have anything going in his brain at all. He just didn't have enough blood sugar. It wasn't his fault. But if the teachers are aware, sometimes I use that example and tell the teachers, because they need to understand that it isn't the child's fault. It isn't the student's fault. They just don't have enough sugar in their brain, that there's anything going on there. And also they need to understand that if your child is taking a test, another thing the 504 says is that if they take a test and they test if they get a grade that is not typical for them, like if they normally are making top grades and then they take this test and they just fail it, and it's because they had bad blood sugar, it is the legal right that they can retake the test. Another thing on the 504 that I think is wonderful is if they have to leave the classroom to get medical help for their diabetes, maybe they have to go see the nurse or something, then the teacher is legally required to reteach whatever material they miss while they're gone, and give it and teach it at the earliest opportunity. And you know, it would seem, especially in elementary school, like these kinds of accommodations, you wouldn't really have to write that out, because of course the teacher would want to do that. But if you think about it, as the child gets older and older and older into high school, those teachers are handling hundreds of students a day. And I think in many cases, they're overwhelmed. And I think they almost, even though some of them would do it anyway, they need to have it written down so that it's very clear what is expected and what, you know, you would like to have happen, and what is the legal right of the student. Another thing to think about, as far as hopefully not middle school, but maybe middle school and high school, is many of the students experiment. They experiment with drugs, they experiment with alcohol and other substances, and it's a tendency of teachers to just think, oh, well, that student is just, you know, kind of zoning out because maybe they're high. Maybe they've taken drugs or something. And they need to understand that in the case of this child, my child, who is type 1 diabetic, that isn't what it is at all, and it needs attention given to it so that it doesn't become a life-threatening situation. Now, my two sons were diagnosed within 4 months of each other, and that was 9-10 years ago. I've really tried to have these teacher meetings every single year. But then last year, my daughter, who was diagnosed 3 years ago, was entering middle school, and I thought, well, my two sons, they've already been through middle school. It's the same school. Probably most of the teachers know our family. And, you know, I don't think I need to have the teacher meeting. And I was very busy, and I just didn't schedule it. And then I went to open house and went around and was meeting each of the teachers. And at each teacher, I would say, now you understand about her diabetes, right? And the math teacher was just wonderful. But he said to me, oh yeah, I know about diabetes. If she needs to go to the nurse anytime, it's fine with me. I'm not going to penalize her or anything. And he didn't understand that she had to be accompanied by someone. And it scared me to death. And I thought I needed to just do the same old teacher presentation that I've done for 10 years, just so everyone is clear, because you never know where there's going to be a little crack in the education. And it's very, very important. I think the buzzword sometimes is advocate. And we need to advocate for our children and think about that we're also advocating for, like I said, any other type 1 diabetic children that may come along after yours. It's something else that I mentioned to the teachers, especially the science teachers. Sometimes they're interested. I am willing to come in and give a little presentation on what type 1 diabetes is, depending on how my child feels about that. Every child is different. Some children are more embarrassed by it, and you know, you don't want it to be that way. But I do try to bring my child with me to this presentation with the teachers so that I can kind of say, here's my child, so you can meet them. And my child is usually very, very embarrassed because they don't know these teachers, and they're just entering middle school and they have 6 new teachers, or you know, something like that. And but I always try to praise my child and tell the teachers they're a good person. And I also really, really try to emphasize, as a last thing to the teachers, that I do not ever intend to sue anyone over my type 1 diabetic child. And if they will simply do their best with the information that I've given them and kind of keep it like CPR in the back of their brain, I would just be very grateful to them. And I am very grateful to them for teaching my children. And I feed them cookies. which I think is a good thing to do, although some teachers can't always eat them. But it's an important thing to have good communication with the teachers. So I would encourage all of you to, in whatever medium you want to do it, communicate with the educators, because they want your child to learn and they want to understand how best to make that happen. And it doesn't have to require a whole bunch of effort or a whole bunch of classroom time disrupted. It's not going to be that way. I had a teacher once raise their hand because I opened it up to questions at the end, and they said to me, "At what point should I panic?" And I just said, you don't ever panic. Even if the child totally passes out and has a seizure on the floor, you don't panic, because I have told you what to do. And you just don't call me, dial 911, and just we'll do our best for this child. So do you have any questions?